And welcome, everybody, to the first episode of Strife's Sanctum with your host, Citizen Strife. Now, you may be wondering what this is, what this is about. I am an avid video game player. I'm an avid Japanese game player for anything from Final Fantasy to Persona, Mario, Zelda, Mega Man, you name it. I've been through the gamut. And I also do that on my own time as a content creator on both YouTube and Twitch. Something I find frustrating a little bit is that I don't get a chance to talk thoroughly about a game, because when you're playing a game on a content platform, there's always a sense that you have to talk with viewers, or you have to talk while the game is going on. You can't really do a deep dive into a game, at least not as well as you'd like to do. So when I wanted to do, say, a review series, I wondered what would be the best thing. My schedule doesn't allow me to do a thing like, physical, video and edited views and crazy effects and all that stuff, but I was able to come up with the idea of doing a podcast. But I also knew that my mode of talking to people on, say, a Twitch or a YouTube is to, if I don't like something, I tend to rail on it, or I tend to overinflate how important a thing is, and I realize that's not how I want to come across in this format. I want to come across as engaged, informative, but I also want to have an analytical yet positive approach to how I want to talk about things. And at the same time, I didn't want this to stretch way too long as a first episode. So when I came up with ideas for what games to do, the first one that came into my head was undoubtedly Final Fantasy. And the start with Final Fantasy, it was released in 1987 by Squaresoft, which was sort of failing itself at the time, trying to make other games. They created this as a last-ditch effort, or they would fold. Turns out this sold very well. And even though Dragon Quest is more notable in Japan for not really changing tack, and it stayed kind of the same thing over and over, and a bit of a comfort food like a Mario game would be, Final Fantasy's always been willing to change and go above and beyond and try different things. And it's always been about, what do we do? These little things in Final Fantasy, little changes to the battle system, or little changes to the characters, or little changes to dynamics. I always think of it like the early Final Fantasies were figuring out how to build its battle system. The middle Final Fantasy games, 6 through 10, were about building strong characters and stories and motivations to play. Later Final Fantasies, for better or for worse, are about refining what came before, but also integrating what modern aesthetics and graphics and things like that nature, but also a more frenetic pace and battle system. Because the older Final Fantasy games are a lot like Dragon Quest, where it's a very slow, methodical, strategic experience, which does have its benefits. Final Fantasy isn't my favorite RPG, but it does have a lot of things going for it. And when I came up with ideas of how to talk about it, I wanted to talk about its plot first, characters, battle system next, get into some of the music, and then also some positives and some negatives about it, and then kind of circle back and see where it feels like it is now. What is its kind of current, when you talk to somebody about Final Fantasy, or you watch a stream about Final Fantasy, what do you get out of it? And for me, what I get out of Final Fantasy is the plot is just save the world, go around, do the thing that you gotta do to revive the world from its evils and its ills, because people are dying, or people are sick, or things are withering and decaying because of these monsters and their overlord that we can't see. And you just gotta go with it. you go to a town, you do the thing, and you do it all over again. It's a cycle. And the cycle itself kind of keeps going into its final act. And whenever plot spoilers come up, and this will be especially true for later episodes, the main thrust of Final Fantasy is, well, there's not too much to spoil. But even if you do, like if you've never played this before, my idea is if you've never watched me before or never played a game before, you don't know what you're in for. So, spoiler warning for anyone who doesn't want to know. If you do, then the basic idea is the first enemy in the game, or the main enemy in the game, Garland, kidnaps a princess. You go about your business and you defeat the fiends, and then you go into the past. You don't know why you go into the past, except that like energy is radiating in a weird vortex kind of thing. And when you get through it, you find out that you're fighting old enemies from the old dungeons, including the four Phaetons of the elements, and it's like really hectic, and you wonder what's going on. And it turns out Garland is actually really the master of chaos. Isn't that what they call him? They call him Chaos. Or I haven't seen the thing, but basically he's the final boss, and he goes over this concept of a time loop where he already knew he was going to get defeated, so he sent the four fiends back into the past to send him into the future and do the thing, and it cycles around, and I don't know, but it does at least give Final Fantasy and Squaresoft this like carte blanche to like do the weird stuff that they do later on. They are willing to go to other worlds. They're willing to meld the worlds together, or you go inside the planet, or you go into different eras of time, or you do time skips, or you do stupid science fiction kind of stuff. It's willing to try different things. And Final Fantasy, despite some things that I don't have a fondness for, I'm still willing to give them points for trying things, even if they don't stick. Because if you don't try anything, you're never going to know what works for you. Much like this podcast. Anyway, so that was the basic plot, and next we get into characters, and to be fair, outside of Garland, there really aren't many characters. There are some NPCs you deal with, but there's really just the 6 party members, or so to say, the 4 warriors of light. But you get to choose from 6 character classes. I do want to preface this before another spoiler warning. Later in the game, about midway, you actually get to change your characters into heavier classes, and while I'm explaining them, I will go over the strengths and weaknesses of both the initial and the later classes, and why people would choose a certain class. The cool thing about Final Fantasy is you're able to choose right up front how many of what type of character you want. If you want 3 warriors, go for it. You want 4 warriors, go for it. You want 4 black mages, do it. You want 2 black mages, a thief, and a warrior, do it. You just change it up, and it always gives you a different experience. The warrior is your tank. He hits hard, he avoids damage. Everybody else is taking 20, 30, 40, 50 damage. He's taking 1, or he's taking 2, and he's doing about 20, 30, 50, 100, 300 damage, and it just doesn't stop. The drawback with him is he tends to take a lot of money to be viable. It's the term high maintenance. So later on, you need to buy the heaviest equipment. It gets pricey. Early on, maybe not so bad, maybe a couple of grind sessions, but no. You might have to wait it out or sell this really good piece of armor, or think, I'm just going to wait for the end of the game when I get the best stuff anyway from a dungeon. That might be a good approach, but it's still kind of a wait and see approach with the knight, which is what he becomes. Because he can use white magic, he becomes a full-on paladin. He can do a little bit of white magic, not the best amount, but he's still as viable a fighter as he ever was. He just smacks hard, and it works. You've also got a black mage. Speaking of hitting hard, instead of using weapons and instead of using armor, he's just standing there and he's just punching away. He's punching away and he's punching away. He's very low effort. The cool thing about the black knight, or the black mage, the black belt, excuse me, is that he doesn't require near as much work to become as viable as the warrior does or the fighter does. He does have less defense because he does have less equipment to handle, but later on, depending on the damage that you do to people, you actually do more damage than the fighter does with your bare hands, because that's what a martial artist does. I mean, you punch stuff. It just works. It's a staple class that has been there forever, much like a fighter, but it takes less effort. There's also the thief, which is fine. He's a lighter weapons class. He's fast, I suppose, but early game he's a bit frustrating. And I've heard a lot of people say it's not the thief that's the draw, it's the ninja. The ninja is the opposite of the knight because he gets to use every weapon and he gets to use black magic. Not every black magic, but enough. So he's very versatile and makes up for that early game frustration. And if you can get past the thief being a weaker class than a fighter or a red mage or a black belt, you can still find him being useful end game and being a great service to your party. As far as the mages go, they are the staples. You kind of have to have a mage, and you kind of have to have a white and a black mage. It just is a thing. Like, you can get away with certain fighter classes. Like, you can get away with a black belt, but, I mean, you might suffer in defense a little bit, but you still fight and hit hard with them. What you don't hit hard with is, dying quick. Dying quick is bad. So you don't want that to happen. So you need a white mage to heal you. You need a black mage to do elemental damage. And they do that in spades. You can see where the simple effectiveness of the battle system is coming into play. You know what the classes are. You know what their defined classes are because they've been ingrained in Final Fantasy lore for so long. And then you have the red mage, who doesn't get as much lore, but is still an interesting idea because he gets to be the jack of all trades, master of none. So he can be the guy that is your secondary damage dealer, your secondary healer, your secondary offensive mage, if you want him to be. He gets to do a little bit of everything and be that, fail-safe system for your party. And it comes across in their upgrades. The white mage can get a high-level offensive spell, but just gets way better healing. You get a black mage who just does nuke. Like, yeah, you could throw out insta-death kills if you want. They almost never work, but you could just nuke a guy. So instead of like later games where they called it flare, nuke. It's just simple. It just works. Nuke. And then red mage gets a little bit of everything. He doesn't get access to the best skills that a white and a black mage does, but he's still, again, going to be viable. And that's where the versatility of the battle system comes into play. At the beginning of the game, you get to pick what you want to be. So never do you ever sense that, like, if something struggles, you can retry. Even if you've been through the game 5 or 10 times, you could try a different combination. You're trying a randomizer. You could try a different setup and see if you can get a faster time. It's so good, and it just works. So even though the plot itself is very basic, the character versatility makes you come back and play through it, makes you fight through the waves of enemies that you keep going through over and over, makes you wonder, what are these enemies going to be like? Well, it comes into the battle system, it comes into play. A lot of times when I'm playing an RPG, I wonder, is it going to be a faster, like action-based battle system, like a Zelda and Ys, a mana game, a Tales game, where you're fighting in the midst of a battle, like a Kingdom Hearts, or are you going to be a more strategic fighting system, like a Fire Emblem? Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, things of that nature, when they first started, they were kind of in the middle. They were still on the slower side, but they managed to do what they needed to do. They managed to get you to think about what you're going to do, because you have the enemies on the screen, you have the fighters on the other side of the screen. So instead of the enemies taking up the entire front of the screen, Dragon Quest or Undertale style, you get to see everything that's on you. And it gets better as, Final Fantasy 2, Final Fantasy 3, you get more of the battlefield, and it, gets faster and faster and faster as things go. But that simple turn-based 3D or, pseudo 2D aesthetic is at least allows you to get a sense of who your characters are. Are they taking damage? Are they doing damage with the right type of spells? What enemies are you fighting? What are they going to do to you? And you get time to think. The benefit of turn-based games, and the one thing I always go back to, is I'm always allowed to think through my fighting. And if I'm not getting it right, well, I might have messed myself up, or maybe I get a critical hit and it all works itself out. You get that little strategy, that little moment where you think, all right, I'm ready. Let's do this fight. Let's go. And then you see the battle play itself out a little bit. You don't get that with other types of battle systems because you have to think fast. And Final Fantasy allows you to start slow and build from there. And it's always been fun. We talked about characters. We talked about the battle system. I think it's high time we talk about the music, though. Because I can talk about graphics all day long. I could talk about story all day long and characters all day long, but nothing in Final Fantasy. And I keep, pounding my chest or whatever, whenever I think about this. The thing that always drives me back to Final Fantasy is the music. Is knowing that when I'm playing a game, a certain song is going to hit at a certain time in the game, and it's just going to be so much fun. So Final Fantasy has been host to either some of the more grand spectacles, like a great boss theme, or something in a death scene, or something in a hectic part of the game. But maybe it's a staple. Maybe it's a staple of the franchise. And when I had to talk about music, I thought, what better music to talk about than the prelude? The opening theme. You open up the disc, or you open up the cartridge, or you open up the Steam page, and you're just like, boom, blue screen, arpeggio, soft, mystical wonder floats over you as you get to know that you are in for a journey. Every subsequent Final Fantasy, or at least most subsequent Final Fantasy games, add something new, a different instrument, a better production quality, a different vibe to the preludes. Some of them even change the genre that they do and act more of like a techno theme, like Final Fantasy X does, if you can spot it. The prelude is always there to give you that familiarity that you are playing a Final Fantasy game, and it's continued when you hear the theme of Final Fantasy, another song that is always there. It's a song that is almost always played in every Final Fantasy, and same idea, but it's a more bombastic theme. It's a sense of accomplishment. It's a sense that this is the grand adventure. This is the grand theme of wonder. It's the complete opposite of the soft opening, getting you into that, wondrous, mystical mindset. This is, you're on the journey now, and you're going. I kind of like that Final Fantasy 12 starts with the theme of Final Fantasy, because it kind of goes into that bombast, but it wouldn't have done it if it wasn't for Final Fantasy doing it first. Speaking of firsts, one of the first things I tried to learn on the guitar, other than like metal themes, was, Final Fantasy music, because that was what I was listening to at the time. And, this is going back a long ways, but I learned to play the battle theme because you would hear it. I would hear it over and over and over again, and it would be fun. This just simple bass line, and then the keyboards or the guitar or whatever the MIDI chip was trying to do at the time. You got to remember, these were very primitive instruments and instrumentation, but what they were able to get out of just 8-bit music at the time, even for a game like Mario or Zelda, these songs stand the test of time. And the battle theme is great because it sets the tone, like almost every Final Fantasy theme until like midway into the franchise started with that bass line. You get the bass line, then you get the hectic, keyboards and stuff, and it would just be a great theme. And it better be, because you're going to spend upwards of 100 battles onto it. It's going to be the theme you hear the most. So even if it may not be the best song, it better be a good one. And it definitely was for me. So we talked about, we talked about what Final Fantasy is. We talked about the plot, characters, music. What I want to do is kind of delve back into them as well with a bit more finesse. Speaking of the battle system, that's where a lot of the kind of issues, and I do want to stress, this isn't going to be a negative in the sense of I'm going to rag on it. This is a negative in the sense that I'm going to think through why it's a negative, but understand why maybe it didn't work, or what they did at least improve on in the future so that things did change for the better. And specifically in the battle system, the idea of inventory, it's the fighter has to spend all this money to get this best armor or this best weapon, or fight in the dungeon with crappy weapons waiting for the thing to get there, the best weapon in the game at that point. Some of the weapons don't even work as intended. Some of the spells, a lot of the buffing spells don't work as intended. The damage spells do. The damage spells work perfectly. And that's kind of what you have to hope for. That being said, the game is very glitchy. It turns the thief into a bit of a lost cause because him running away is not as effective as you'd hope for. A lot of the buffing spells or the debuffing spells just don't interact with the characters the way you were hoping for, so something wrong happens. But again, this was their first attempt, and even if things like ineffective, the idea that you hit an enemy and he dies, and then you try to hit the enemy again and it doesn't instantly bounce to the other enemy, it just makes you think more. It makes you plan out your battles more and think through what attacks you have to do the damage to the enemy and then hit the other one later. So there you go. The other thing that drives me up the wall a little bit is the time loop. And I spoke about this before. And sorry if my voice is cracking. I actually had to re-record this. The time loop sets the tone for Final Fantasy in the sense that they are going to do different things. And even though it can be an interesting experience, it doesn't always mean it's framed in the right way. I think time loops and time paradoxes run the risk of, like, the best example I could throw out isn't even, like, it's from a game, but think of, like, without spoiling it, think of like your son is going to turn into your great grandfather of this thing. It's almost like a Spaceballs kind of thing. Like, you do this, so it creates the person in the past to do this thing in the future. You can see where it just gets all muddy. And the idea that Garland himself goes through this like weird change, and sorry for the slap there, but you go for this weird time paradox idea and it doesn't flesh itself out. Again, this was a story. I don't know if it was the best idea. I mean, the alternative would have been like the four fiends empower him and just zap him with some goo and he becomes chaos, right? It would have been, kind of boring, I guess. Or he could have just done the I have my second form, that sort of thing, which is almost as cliche. So the time loop itself doesn't exactly pan out the way they were hoping, but it's not a bad thing either. So I'd say it's hit or miss. But getting back to the positives, and a lot of that can be traced to the replayability. Whether you're playing it for the first time, whether you're playing it again in the original setting, or you're playing a different version of the game with improved graphics or better balancing issues, or if you're doing a randomizer. I spoke about randomizers before. You're taking an 8-hour or 10-hour game of straightforward gameplay, and then you're asked to take this party to go to this place to find this thing, but it could be over here, and you go into different spots in different areas and try different things. You have this sense of familiarity, but it's always going to be different. You're always going to be fighting something different. You're going to be fighting something foreign because you know enough about the game that you can sneak through it. But because you're fighting with a different party member, or you're fighting with a different loadout, or you're trying to fight with a different item or a different spell, you can always try something different. So it gives you that sense of wonder. So even though it is a simple experience, it doesn't mean that it's a bad one. It means that it's a comforting experience. It's a comfort food. And that's the thing I want to stress more than anything else about Final Fantasy, is it is a comfort food. Even if other games are hit or miss or good or bad, or, you know, even if you don't think Final Fantasy 1 is the best Final Fantasy, I don't think anybody's going to say it's their best. It may be their favorite, but it's always going to have a place because of that simplicity. And I do want to take this time to go back and refresh it before ending today. The idea that Final Fantasy gave you was, this is our last opportunity. This is the character's last opportunity. This is the developer's last opportunity to make something special. And they succeeded. The party succeeded. The enemy, like the developers, succeeded more than they could have imagined, because even 35 years later, people still talk about this game. They still have that sense of, where were you when you first played this? Where were you when you first tried this thing or this thing or this thing, or fought this guy and changed and tried this version of the game? Because you could try a different version. And especially now that stuff like the Pixel remasters are coming out, or the new Chaos game is coming out, you know, it's like, Final Fantasy is always going to be there. And it's always going to be there for you if you need it. Again, is it my favorite? No. But I respect what it did at the time it did it, because without it, the franchise as a whole would have not existed anymore. But that should do it for me. Hopefully, people enjoyed it. This is an interesting experience for me. I've never really done podcasting, never done radio, never done anything other than, say, Twitch or YouTube and stuff like that. So hopefully this is, if this was your first time learning about Final Fantasy, awesome. If this was like, I've learned about Final Fantasy and played it 50 million times, I know the ins and outs, and you still got something out of it, and you just refreshed it and got like a tingle down your spine or something, or you just got angry, it's great. If you were able to get something out of this experience, that's all I could have ever asked for. Because my hope is that I end up making more and doing better and doing better and doing better at this as I go on. And it's not just going to be Final Fantasy. It's going to be other franchises, and not just Square Enix franchises. I mean, it's going to be the next one in 2 weeks is going to be Secret of Mana. So that one's going to be really special to me. I do have other games and different franchises like Tales, Persona, Dot Hack, Odin Sphere is a one-off, like every other Final Fantasy game, but Mario, Link, or Zelda, I keep saying Link, Sonic, you name it. Any game from Japan that I know I've played or want to play, I've probably done it and really want to do an episode about it and kind of review them in the same way. But again, I'm hoping that it came across in a positive way. I don't want any of this to become as like a negative experience. I don't want anybody to feel like I'm trying to rag on a game here. So if I get to another game and I feel that I'm not as familiar with it, let's say if you wanted me to play a game that I hadn't thought of before, I have time, I want to play it, like a Suikoden or a Legend of Dragoon or whatever. If a game that you can think of is something that I might not have put on my list and would want to hear me talk about it, I'll put it on my list. If you do have some like concerns or comments or just general words of what I could do better, what I can do better to make this the best podcast for you as a listener and for me as a presenter, please let me know. Please comment. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. I'd love for this to become a thing that people would enjoy and talk about and share with other people. But if not, if you'd like to just watch video game footage, I do stuff on Twitch with citizen underscore Strife. I mostly play Persona rhythm games and dancing games on there just as a change of pace. I do JRPG playthroughs on this channel primarily. This is my first chance at doing a podcast. I loved how I said it, podcast. But again, this is going to be a thing I hope to build something and build a different type of audience. Maybe you're not into the games but want to hear about them or hear me review them, or like you're thinking about wanting to buy them and don't know if you want to buy them. If this is doing any of that, then thank you. And if this has influenced you at all, if this is a good thing for you, I will keep doing it and I will really appreciate it. All I know is that without people helping you in your daily lives, you would be nothing. Not in a bad way. I mean in a sense of gratitude. So if nothing else, I do want to say thank you to anyone who listened to it, whether it had been for a second, whether for a minute, or the entire podcast. If you enjoyed it, thank you. And this is Citizen Strife, signing off.